He was a soldier who left the world behind. His only partner? A German shepherd he trusted more than any human. But a soldier's past is never truly buried. It returned, wearing the face of his oldest friend. One act of betrayal, and Jake was framed, hunted. Now, with only his loyal shepherd, Wolf, by his side, they must race that betrayer across the globe. Because the artifact he stole is not a prize. It's a key, and the world will not survive what it unlocks. The high, thin air of the Oregon wilderness was still, broken only by the rhythmic strike of an axe. Jake Vance, 42 and weathered by more than just the elements, split another log. His movements were economical, precise. Every action had a purpose. It was a discipline learned long ago, one that had failed him exactly once, ending his military career and sending him into this self-imposed retirement. Nearby, a magnificent German shepherd watched, his thick coat a mixture of silver and gray. This was Wolf. At 6 years old, the dog possessed a quiet gravity, his gaze constantly sweeping the perimeter of their small cabin. He was Jake's shadow, his anchor. Their bond was forged in the silence of shared trauma. They trusted each other in a way neither trusted the world. A new sound violated the peace. It began as a faint vibration, then grew into a rhythmic, heavy chopping that tore through the silence. Wolf was on his feet instantly. A low warning rumbled in Wolf's chest, his ears pinned flat. Jake lowered the axe. "Easy, boy. Company." A black, unmarked helicopter crested the ridge and descended onto the meadow, its rotors flattening the tall grass. The side door slid open. A man stepped out, his expensive gear immaculate, moving with a predatory grace that was entirely out of place in the wilderness. "Jake," the man called out, his voice smooth, "you look terrible." "Julian," Jake said, his voice flat. "Julian Thorne, you're a long way from home." "Business," Julian said, flanked now by 2 heavily armed mercenaries. "I'm here to recruit you." "I'm retired," Jake said. "Professor Alistair sends his regards," Julian said, examining his gloves. "He's been my guest for 2 days. He is persuasive. He told me you're the only one who knows where he hid the starting relic." Jake's grip tightened on the axe handle. Alistair, his mentor, the man who had been a father to them both before Julian's ambition fractured their lives. "He's not your guest. He's your prisoner." "Semantics," Julian shrugged. "Find the relic for me, and he's free." Jake knew it was a lie, but Alistair's life was on the line. He gave a curt nod. An hour later, they stood inside the darkness of a local cave system, the air thick with moisture. Following Jake's directions, they reached a small alcove hidden behind a waterfall. Jake located the pressure-sensitive trap Alistair had described, disarmed it with steady hands, and retrieved the artifact, a small, intricately carved piece of obsidian. He handed it to Julian. Julian smiled, his eyes cold in the beam of his flashlight. He turned to his men. "Clean this up." The soldiers raised their rifles. But Wolf had not been watching the relic. He had been watching the men. Before the safety clicks finished, the dog sensed the shift in intent. A deep snarl exploded from him as he launched, a blur of gray fur, striking the nearest soldier in the chest and knocking him off balance. The sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed through the cave as the other soldier fired. "Wolf, here!" Jake yelled. He tackled Julian, grabbing the relic back in the chaos, and shoved his dog toward the sound of rushing water. "Go!" Jake dove after him, plunging into the icy blackness of the underground river just as the cave lit up with gunfire. They emerged from the underground river miles downstream, hypothermic and bruised, but alive. Jake checked Wolf for injuries, his hands skimming the dog's thick, wet fur. The shepherd, though shivering violently, stood firm, leaning against Jake's leg. They were exposed. Julian had the relic, and now, thanks to him, Jake Vance was a fugitive. Getting out of Oregon was a logistical nightmare. Air travel was impossible. His face would be flagged by security systems before he even reached the gate. And then there was Wolf. Traveling internationally with a 90-pound shepherd required a mountain of paperwork and quarantine, none of which they had time for. Jake called in the last favor he had, activating a dormant network of military veterans he still trusted. Days later, they were in the dark, damp hold of a cargo ship, the air thick with the smell of diesel and salt. The constant low thrum of the engines vibrated through the steel floor, keeping Wolf on edge. The long journey across the Atlantic was agonizing, but the dog never complained, taking comfort only from Jake's proximity. They disembarked under the cover of darkness in Crete, making their way inland to a remote, windswept archaeological site. They found Eris Thorne sorting pottery shards in a dusty tent. He was a thin man in his late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that held a profound, lingering sadness. He looked nothing like his brother. "Jake," Eris said, his voice quiet. He didn't seem surprised. He gestured to a water bowl he had already set out. Wolf approached it cautiously and began to drink. "You were followed, not just by me, by them." "Alistair is alive," Jake said, dispensing with pleasantries. "For now," Eris said, his face grim. He led Jake to a tent filled with maps and digital reconstructions of ancient tablets. "Julian is obsessed. He calls it seismic harmony. He believes the relic can amplify and direct tectonic energy. He intends to hold the world hostage with the threat of earthquakes." Eris pointed to a complex transcription. "The starting relic is just the key. It needs this to function, the guiding melody. It's an ancient frequency map." A sharp sound cut the air. It wasn't loud, but it was definitive, the metallic snick of a bolt-action rifle. "Julian's men. They tracked you here," Eris hissed, pushing Jake toward the edge of the camp. "You must take this." The firefight erupted instantly. The air filled with the sharp cracks of gunfire, the shots echoing off the nearby ruins. Wolf barked, a deep, resonant sound, staying low as Jake returned fire. Eris wasn't running. He was desperately trying to shield the stone tablets, the source of his research. "He can't have the original," Eris yelled. A mercenary rounded the corner. Eris saw him and threw his body over the priceless carvings. The soldier fired. The sound of the shot was final. Eris collapsed, his blood staining the ancient stone. Enraged, Jake fired 2 precise shots, forcing the soldier back. He ran to Eris, but it was too late. Eris grabbed Jake's jacket, forcing a small, durable data slate into his hand. He must be stopped." "Wolf, go!" Jake yelled, grabbing the slate. Grief and adrenaline surged through him. He and Wolf scrambled into the darkness of the ravine, leaving the sounds of the battle and Eris Thorne behind. The data slate Eris had died for was their only map. It led them from the Mediterranean to the scorched ancient plains of Iraq. The guiding melody wasn't music, but a complex data file mapping stellar alignments and magnetic anomalies, pointing to a location Julian with only the relic could never find. They traveled rough, staying off main roads, the heat oppressive even after sunset. Wolf panted heavily in the back of the borrowed truck, but his focus never wavered. Their contact was in a small city near the rumored dig site. Jake found the antiquity shop exactly where the instructions said it would be. He knocked on the heavy wooden door. It opened a crack. "We are closed," a woman's voice said. "I was sent by Eris Thorne," Jake said quietly. "He said you were monitoring the thieves." The door opened wider. The woman, Nadia Al-Jamil, pulled them inside quickly. She was in her late 40s, with intelligent, tired eyes and an air of professional frustration. She wore practical khaki clothing, covered in the fine dust of the desert. "You are Jake," she stated, not asking. "And this," she looked at Wolf with appreciation, "is the shepherd Eris mentioned." "They call themselves the Aegis Order," Nadia explained, pouring them glasses of water. Wolf drank gratefully from a bowl she provided. "They arrived 3 weeks ago with heavy equipment and armed guards. They are not archaeologists. They are destroyers, led by your Julian Thorne. They are tearing apart our heritage." "They're looking for the Aurum relic," Jake said. "Alistair is still their prisoner." "They will find nothing but sand," Nadia said bitterly. "They are digging, yes, violently, but I have watched them. They are in the wrong place." That night, Nadia drove them to the edge of the vast restricted excavation site. It was an industrial scar on the landscape, bathed in the harsh glare of floodlights, the rumble of heavy machinery echoing through the night. "Julian is arrogant," Jake observed, studying the operation through binoculars. "He has the key, the relic, but Eris had the instructions. He's digging half a mile too far south." "The true site, the one my ancestors called the City of Whispers, is over that ridge," Nadia pointed, "but the perimeter is heavily patrolled." "We go over the ridge," Jake said. "Wolf with me." They moved under the cover of a moonless sky, using the dunes for cover. Nadia proved to be a capable guide, but it was Wolf who saved them. The shepherd moved ahead, a gray shadow against the dark sand. Suddenly, he froze, dropping into a low crouch and blocking Jake's path with his body. Jake pulled Nadia down. They waited. Seconds later, a vehicle without lights, a dune buggy carrying 2 armed guards, sped past their position, not 10 yards away. They continued, nearing the ridge. Again, Wolf stopped. He didn't make a sound, but Jake saw the fur on his back bristle. The dog's nose was pointed toward a narrow passage in the rocks. Jake listened. He heard only the wind, but Wolf heard the subtle crunch of boots on gravel. Jake signaled to Nadia, and they slipped into a dark crevice. A 2-man foot patrol passed by, their voices carrying on the breeze. Wolf remained perfectly still until the sound of their steps faded. "He is well trained," Nadia whispered. "He's just loyal," Jake replied. They reached the crest of the ridge and looked down. There, untouched by Julian's machines, lay the dark, silent ruins of the real lost city. The true City of Whispers was a graveyard of shadows. Jake, Nadia, and Wolf moved through the silent, crumbling structures, the contrast to Julian's noisy excavation stark. Wolf stayed close, his senses alert to the ancient stillness. Following the data on Eris's slate, Nadia led them to a large, circular building, its roof mostly intact. This was the map room. Inside, the air was cool and dry. In the center of the chamber sat a massive, intricate scale model of the entire valley, carved from the bedrock. "This is it," Nadia whispered, her voice filled with awe. Jake consulted the data slate. Eris was right. It's not just a map. It's a timepiece. We have to wait for sunset. They waited as the desert light outside shifted from white-hot to a deep burnt orange. As the sun touched the horizon, a single beam of light shot through a perfectly aligned aperture in the ceiling. It struck a crystal set into the floor. "Now, Jake," Nadia urged. Jake activated the data slate. It projected the complex pattern of the guiding melody. He aligned the projection with the stone map. The light from the aperture refracted through the pattern, splitting into dozens of smaller beams. One by one, they illuminated points on the model until only one bright red beam remained, pointing to a small, unassuming structure at the city's edge. "There," Jake said. "The tomb?" They found the entrance beneath a collapsed floor, a dark square hole leading down into the earth. The air that rose from it was foul, thick with the smell of decay. Jake went first. Wolf, sensing his master's hesitation, pushed his head firmly against Jake's back, nudging him forward. They descended into a narrow passage. The darkness was absolute, broken only by their flashlights. And then they heard it, a sound like dry leaves skittering over stone, a low, constant chittering that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Jake aimed his light at the floor. It was moving. A living carpet of black, iridescent beetles, thousands of them, flowed around their boots. Nadia stifled a cry. Jake froze, his breathing catching in his chest. He hated this. The feeling of being crawled on, of being overwhelmed by countless small things. Wolf let out a low, uneasy whine. He hated the unstable footing, the way the insects clicked against his paws. But he looked at Jake. He saw his alpha's fear, and his training, his loyalty, took over. He pressed his body hard against Jake's leg, a solid, warm presence in the crawling dark. "It's okay, boy," Jake muttered, forcing himself to move. "We're okay." He pushed forward, the insects crunching under his boots. They entered a larger chamber. There, on a stone dais, sat the Aurum relic. It was a device of black obsidian and tarnished copper, humming with a low, dissonant energy that made their teeth ache. And chained to the far wall, a pale figure in the shadows, was Professor Alistair. He was alive, but barely. His clothes were in tatters, and he looked frail. "Professor!" Jake shouted, rushing forward. Alistair's head lifted, his eyes fluttering open. "Jake," he whispered, a look of profound relief washing over his face. You came." "We're getting you out, Professor," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion as he worked at the ancient rusted shackles binding Alistair to the wall. The old man was frail, his skin pale and papery in the beam of their flashlights. He leaned heavily on Nadia. "You came," Alistair whispered, his voice cracking. "I knew you would." Jake finally broke the last lock. As he helped Alistair to his feet, Wolf, standing guard at the chamber's entrance, let out a low, menacing growl. The sound vibrated in the small space. "What is it, boy?" Jake asked, turning. A sudden, blinding white light flooded the tomb, pinning them against the far wall. What a touching reunion. Julian Thorne stepped into the chamber, flanked by 6 heavily armed mercenaries from the Aegis Order. He was smiling, his expression one of perfect, predictable victory. "You knew," Jake said, his voice flat. He instinctively moved to shield Alistair. "Of course I knew," Julian replied, as if explaining something to a child. "You are wonderfully predictable, Jake. You chased the clues, I simply had to chase you. It saved me a significant amount of digging." Jake shoved Nadia and Alistair behind the stone dais where the relic hummed. "Stay back!" he yelled, drawing his pistol. The sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed, deafeningly loud in the confined space. A bullet chipped the stone inches from Jake's head. He returned fire, the flash of his own weapon barely visible among the soldiers' tactical lights. Wolf barked, a deep, furious sound, snarling and snapping at the men who tried to advance. The tomb filled with shouting and the concussion of gunfire. But Jake saw the reality in seconds. They were trapped. They were outgunned. Nadia was an archaeologist, and Alistair could barely stand. One of the soldiers took careful aim, not at Jake, but directly at the professor. "No!" Jake shouted. He tossed his pistol, sending it skittering across the stone floor. "Stop, we surrender." "Hold your fire," Julian commanded. Silence fell, broken only by Wolf's continued growl. "Wolf down," Jake ordered. His voice was strained, heavy with defeat. The shepherd whimpered, his anger warring with his master's command, but he slowly lowered himself to the ground, his eyes never leaving the soldiers. "A wise choice," Julian said. The mercenaries moved in quickly, binding Jake's and Nadia's hands. They pulled Alistair up roughly. "Take the relic," Julian ordered his men. Then he looked at the dog. "And bring the shepherd. He's leverage." "He's just an animal," one soldier muttered. "He is Jake's last anchor," Julian corrected. "Crate him." They were marched out of the tomb and into the cold desert night. A massive, matte black cargo plane sat on a makeshift runway, its engines idling. Jake, Nadia, and Alistair were forced up the ramp into the cavernous hold. Jake watched, his gut twisting, as 2 soldiers wrestled Wolf into a steel transport crate. The sound of the heavy bolt locking the crate door echoed in the hold. The crate was loaded and secured like cargo. The heavy ramp began to whine as it closed, sealing them in darkness. The converted oil rig was a fortress of rust and steel, isolated by miles of churning black ocean. Julian's men forced them to the central platform, which had been modified into a terrifying combination of modern technology and ancient architecture. At its center was the amplification chamber. "Tie them there," Julian ordered, pointing to a support beam. Jake, Nadia, and Alistair were bound, forced to face the device. Across the platform, a frantic barking sound came from the steel crate where Wolf was trapped, the noise almost lost in the wind. Julian moved with theatrical reverence. He placed the Aurum relic into the chamber's core. Then he held up the obsidian piece from Oregon, the starting relic. "The key," he whispered, sliding it into a slot. He turned to a control panel and activated the sequence. A low, guttural hum began, vibrating through the metal deck. The Aurum relic began to shake violently. And then a pinprick of light appeared, swelling rapidly into a blinding, pure white brilliance that bleached all color from the world. Julian watched, mesmerized. "Julian, no!" Alistair, finding a last reserve of strength, screamed over the noise. "It's not a weapon. It's a gateway. Don't look at it, Jake. The light will swallow you." The warning struck Jake with the force of a physical blow. He understood instantly. "Nadia, close your eyes. Don't look," he roared, slamming his own eyes shut and turning his face away, burying it against the cold steel beam. Nadia squeezed her eyes shut, terrified. But Julian and his mercenaries were transfixed. They stared, paralyzed by the beauty of the power they had unleashed. "It's beautiful," Julian breathed. A wave of pure energy, silent and absolute, pulsed outward from the relic. It wasn't an explosion. It was an unmaking. Julian and his soldiers didn't scream. They didn't burn. They simply dissolved, turning to fine gray ash that the sea wind instantly scattered into the night. The blinding light vanished, replaced by a critical, high-pitched whine from the relic. The energy pulse had shorted the electronic locks on their restraints. "It's overloading!" Jake yelled, tearing his hands free. Explosions began to rock the rig. Jake didn't hesitate. He ran to Wolf's crate and kicked the damaged latch, throwing the door open. The shepherd burst out, a blur of gray, immediately pressing against Jake's side. "Nadia, help Alistair, we have to go!" They sprinted, Wolf leading the way as the platform buckled. They reached the emergency lifeboat station just as the relic detonated. A massive, silent column of energy shot into the sky, vaporizing the rig's core. Jake cut the lifeboat loose. They fell, hitting the churning water hard, and paddled frantically away as the entire rig, a mountain of fire, collapsed into the sea. Nessa. Hours later, the gray light of dawn found them on the deck of a government vessel. They were wrapped in shock blankets. Wolf lay at Jake's feet, exhausted, his head resting on his master's knee. A quiet agent in a clean suit approached. "We've swept the area. There's nothing. No relic, no trace of the rig. It's over." The agent walked away. Alistair, weak but alive, caught Jake's eye. They said nothing. They didn't have to. They both knew that secrets this powerful didn't just disappear. They waited. In the end, the relics we chase are rarely as valuable as the loyalty that finds us. The strongest, bravest heart in the story often walks on four paws. That is the simple, powerful truth we explore in all our Paws Narratives. If Jake and Wolf's journey found a place in your heart, we hope you'll subscribe so we can continue to share these stories with you. We would be truly honored to read about the loyal friends who have shared your life's adventures in the comments below. The journey continues, and the next narrative is waiting for you now, right on the screen.